Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. Currently, there's a tremendous amount of controversy going on over the subject of Christian nationalism. And I think the problem is that American society and the Western world has changed a great deal over the past 50, 75 years or so. And that means that there are social conservatives who are concerned about the fact that the America supposedly has departed from the Christian principles on which it was founded. And this in turn has provoked a reaction on the part of the left that wants to say America was not a Christian nation, and we believe in separation of church and state, and therefore Christians have no right to, quote unquote, impose their values on everyone else. Recently, there was a debate on the Modern Day Debate channel between Kayse Melone and Andrew Wilson. Kayse Melone is a young woman who is an exvangelical, was raised in a Christian home, has departed from the faith. She tends to stress economic issues now and to argue that the real problem facing America today is economic injustice. Sometimes she comes across as sounding a little bit like a neo-Marxist. So they had this debate, and there was the debate question was: Is Christian nationalism bad for America? And Kayse Melone argued in the affirmative, and Wilson argued in the negative. Now, I have to tell you, I have to confess, I only listened to the opening statements of the debate. The whole debate lasted for like 3 hours, or over 3 hours, and you listen to it, and they both came across as a little bit off the wall. But basically, what Kayse Malone's position was this: she says that Christian nationalism is a misdirection from the root cause of economic society and instability for everyday citizens, which is actually the system of capitalism itself. So she focuses in on the economic problems. She notices that there's tremendous economic inequality. She says that this is the result of the capitalistic system, and that she would argue that both Christians and atheists need to work together to try to correct that and create greater economic equality. And unfortunately, she seems to reject the idea of the divine command theory of morality. Like a lot of atheists, she tries to argue that you can be a humanist, you can advocate justice and empathy without having to appeal to divine command. And at one point, she says these same values, that is, Christian values, are derived from evolutionary drive um, innate within all of us to protect the species, especially the next generation, the young. And so she wants economic justice for everyone. And she says the movement I would rather advocate for, which we can design together, is one focused on material economic justice for everyone, Christian or otherwise. I am focused on the shared humanity of everyone on the planet. So it certainly sounds very, very commendable on her part. Now, Andrew Wilson, um, I would have to say, was a bit of a disappointment. Uh, he hurled all kinds of accusations at her. He was very sarcastic. He was very profane. He dropped the F bomb a few times, and I just listened to the opening statements of them. And he's doing all of this in the name of Christian nationalism. And but he criticized. He spent most of his time criticizing liberal policy positions, which she didn't necessarily have said that she necessarily held to all of them. Among other things, he was critical of the COVID restrictions that were imposed by the government during the height of the COVID pandemic. And but he did point out correctly that basically each side would have to impose its agenda on the nation as a whole. That it's not just a matter of conservatives trying to turn America into a theocracy. The fact of the matter is that America, a human society, has to function on a commonly shared base of values. And so then the question is, whose values are we going to use to do that? And I would argue that both sides were wrong, and that basically they both missed the connection between Christian morality and social justice. So let's start with Kayse Melone's position. Um, Basically, the problem here is one of the kind of idiosyncrasies of the modern Western left, and that is try to promote social justice, but to do it on a secular basis. So, of course, I'm old enough to remember when it started off with the civil rights movement back in the 1950s and 1960s, and but the problem then, so people were marching in the streets to promote racial equality and to promote racial equality. But at the same time that that happened, the university system was becoming thoroughly secular, and this in turn would lead to a denial of moral objective morality and of moral absolutes. So then this raises a serious question. How in the world can you advocate social justice in the absence of any kind of a coherent moral framework? What exactly constitutes moral justice? And what ultimately determines right and wrong? And so there were anti-war demonstrations during the Vietnam War, and eventually the whole thing kind of disintegrated into sex and drugs and rock and roll. And so that's where the left wound up. Um, so then you come to this question, do Black Lives Matter? And the question is, well, why? And so at one point, Kayse Melone says that evolution, she tries to appeal to the theory of evolution. She doesn't want to appeal to Christian morality or divine revelation or the Bible. So instead, she says that evolution gives us a drive innate within us to protect the species. Well, is that really true? I mean, in a way, logically, it sort of sounds like it makes sense that, that if we're thinking logically, we want to think in terms of, it's kind of like an enlightened self-interest. We want to think in terms of what's in the best interest of society as a whole, and obviously it should be that we would work together to create tolerable, favorable living conditions for everyone, and that we would share the wealth and so on. And logically, that sounds very appealing and attractive. But the problem in actual practice, what happens is that, but can you really justify that from social Darwinism? And the problem is that, or can you really justify that from the idea of Darwinian evolution? And the problem is that there arose a movement called social Darwinism, which argues that basically it's all about the survival of the fittest. The problem is that Darwin advocated the idea of natural selection. And so you had people advocating eugenics, and you have to get rid of what's in the best interest of the species, and to get rid of the people who are weak and can't take care of themselves, so that when the species will advance that way. And what happens in actual practice is that even though logically, if we sit down and we think about it, it would certainly make sense that life would be more tolerable and more pleasant if we looked out for each other and took care of each other. But in actual practice, people routinely exploit and take advantage of each other. And one of the problems, I think, with Kayse Malone's position is that by putting all the emphasis the way she does on the economic issues, she overlooks the disintegration of the family structure and the disruption of family life. Because of the breakdown in public morality, we've seen the break up the family structure. So one of the biggest problems, and I've witnessed it firsthand, doing taxes and working for the Census Bureau, is that you've got a whole generation of children growing up in these dysfunctional single-parent families. And I worry especially about the young men, the boys, the young men, who have little or no contact with their biological fathers, and have little sense of how you'd make it. They haven't seen good role models. They have little sense of how you'd make a marriage work. And not surprisingly, the boys in particular wind up getting in trouble with the law. And it could be argued that that's one of the underlying causes for even the economic poverty that exists in society today. And so, yeah, sometimes she comes across as kind of a neo-Marxist, wants to place all of the emphasis on economic determinism. But I think there's more to the problems of American society than that. Now, on the other hand, the problem with Wilson's position is that he wants to defend capitalism. And he's trying to combine capitalism with Christianity. And it could be argued that that's not really true. That's kind of a false combination. So you have to ask yourself, what exactly is Christianity? If there were such a thing as a Christian nation, what would it look like? Well, first of all, of course, the Bible tells us that morality originates with God. So, for example, in Micah 6:8, and reading from the New King James Version, it says, "He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." So in other words, morality comes down to a matter of what God requires of us. And it's interesting that even though Micah was Jewish, he says, he has shown you, oh man. He's addressing the entire human race. And he's basically saying that the entire human race is ultimately accountable to God for what it does. And that it's God who sets down the rules. And what are the rules that God has set down? He says, but to do justly, to love mercy. To do justly would mean to treat each other fairly and respect each other's rights. To love mercy, And there's the idea of showing kindness towards others, and to walk humbly with your God. In other words, we're supposed to, basically acknowledge God as our Creator and walk humbly before Him. Now then, what are the key Christian moral principles? And of course, they're laid out. Jesus laid those out in Matthew chapter 22, and beginning with verse 35. It says, "Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, and saying, 'Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?' Jesus said to him, 'You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.'" And so the idea there then, if you ask, so what exactly is it that God wants to do? Well, Jesus quotes two commandments from the Old Testament, and he says, first of all, we ought to love the Lord our God with all our heart and all our mind and all our soul. And then second of all, we have to basically love each other as ourselves. And that means we look out for each other's well-being. And it could be argued that the classic example of that that he gives us is the parable of the Good Samaritan, where a Samaritan who wasn't even Jewish is walking along and he sees somebody that's been badly injured, and so the Samaritan takes care of him and takes him off to an inn and pays for a stay there and so on, even though the guy was a total stranger to him. And that's what the Christian morality should look like. What God wants us to do is not to go around through life just looking out for our own individual self-interest, but He wants us to love Him, and He wants us to love others as ourselves. And so when you see someone in need, you take care of them, and so on. And then that would mean especially that you meet their financial needs and necessary. So for example, in 1 John 3, verses 16 and 17, we read, "By this we know love, because He laid down His life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him?" So in other words, loving your neighbor as yourself means that if you see your neighbor and he's suffering or he's in need and you have the means to help him out, then you help him out. And so that's what, and it's true that the early church actually practiced a form of communism. They sold their possessions and they put it in a common fund, and they made sure that everybody had what they needed. So strictly speaking, America is not a Christian nation, and it never really has been. I mean, it might have been superficially Christian, but it has an economic system which is based on selfishness and greed. Human beings by nature are selfish and greedy, and the reason why capitalism seems to work better than other economic systems is precisely because it appeals to man's fallen and sinful human nature. And even Puritan colonial New England couldn't make socialism work, and they basically had to revert back to everybody owning their own personal property. And but that doesn't make capitalism Christian, okay? And that's the thing that we have to keep in mind. I also think it has to be pointed out that America, as it stands today, has been officially atheistic since 1947. What happened is that in that year there was a case that came before the Supreme Court, Everson versus the Board of Education, and it had to do with the interpretation of the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. And what the court ruled on that case was neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. Now notice what it said there, that neither the federal government nor the state can pass a law which aid religions. And so that means that, practically speaking, the federal government and the public education system are in a position where they cannot acknowledge the existence of a supreme being. So then you run into a situation where when America has become so morally bankrupt that even today, when you have a Supreme Court with a supposedly super conservative majority, and an abortion case comes up before it, it cannot determine. The big question, like a Roe v. Wade, was: is an unborn child a human person that has a right to life, to under the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses of the Fifth and 14th Amendments. And even on the more recently, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, they still couldn't answer that question. Instead, they just referred the issue back to the states. Now, the court had backed off a little bit from the original position in 1952, but then with the infamous Regent's Prayer case of 1962, it reverted back to its position of saying that the government mustn't do anything to aid religion in general. And that's was resulted in the moral collapse of America today. So today, America is in an advanced state of social decline. The family structure has broken down. Children are brought up in dysfunctional single-parent families. And the ultimate cause is that America and the Western world has rejected the basic principles of Judeo-Christian morality. And so we're adrift morally. And democracy cannot survive under those circumstances. It results in social chaos, which then leads to an authoritarian government. And as Christians, we have to keep in mind, however, when we see all this going on around us, as Christians, we're called to be lights shining in the darkness. In other words, we have to live lives of nonconformity to the surrounding world, and we're to show love to people in need. And so in politics, we have to be very, very careful that we don't wind up endorsing the sinful practices of the society around us. I think Christians do need to speak out on specific moral issues like abortion, for example, and the sanctity of marriage. We should have opposed no-fault divorce. But at the same time, we got to be very, very careful about aligning ourselves too closely with a major political party or with a controversial politician. We have to protect the reputation of the church and of Christ. And so the bottom line is we need to do all to the glory of God. And that's what we need to be thinking about as Christians as we live in this increasingly decadent society. So thank you for listening, and I hope you take all of that to heart. Bye now.